The desert dark was cold and eerily silent, a vast expanse of sand stretching out under a canopy of stars that seemed indifferent to the storm about to break. Obviously, it was March 2003, and the world held its breath. On the meet between Kuwait and Iraq, thousands of engines were idling, a low mechanical hum that vibrated through the boot soldier and Marines' wait for the order to cross the berm. Notably, but before the tanks could roll, the sky had to be uncluttered. High above the earth, far beyond the reach of the naked eye, the opening moves of Operation Iraqi Freedom were already in motion. This was not just a war of soldier, it was a war of machines, of engineering so advanced it seemed magic, designed to dismantle a regime without destroying a nation. And here's the deal, the objective was clear: remove Hussein from power. Also, the method was overwhelmed force, speed, and precision. Thousands of miles away, at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, the hangar door opened to reveal the distinct, alien shape of the B-2 Spirit. Definitely, it looked less like an airplane and more like a shadow cut from the fabric of the night sky. Here's the bottom line: this was the tip of the spear. The pilots climb up into the cockpit, settling in for a mission that would span continents. They weren't deploying to a forward base. They were flight directly from the Pump of America to the bosom of Baghdad and back again. As the massive flying wing taxied onto the runway, its four engines shrieked with the suppressed power. The gang cognized they were carrying a content that would be delivered with devastating accuracy. The B-2 lifted off, a dark ghost rising into the clouds, unseeable to radio detection and ranging, invisible to the foeman. It was a lone flight crossways the Atlantic, refueling in midair from tankers that acted as flying gas stations, a delicate dance of fuel probes and jet fuel at 30,000 pace. As the B-2s approached Iraqi airspace, the tension in the cockpit was palpable. They were flying into one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the cosmos, a web of surface-to-air missile and anti-aircraft guns that Saddam Hussein had spent decades building. But on the radar screen of the Iraqi defense crews, the B-2s simply did not exist. The stealth engineering absorbed and deflected the microwave radar waves, leaving the screen blank. The pilots checked their systems, verifying the organized bidding bunkers and communication centers deep inside Baghdad. The bomb bay doors opened, and the Joint Direct Onrush Munitions, or JDAMs, fell away. These weren't the dense bombs of former warfare. They were smart weapons, steered by GPS to hit inside PES of their target. Basically, the pilot turned the great bat-like plane about, beginning the long journey abode, while below them, the first cracks appeared in the regime's foundation. Meanwhile, in the Persian disconnection, the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln sliced through the dark waters, turned into the wind. The flying deck was a disorderly ballad of noise and steam. Catapults hissed, and jet clap deflectors rose like walls of steel. The pilots of the F-88 Hornet sat strapped to their ejection seats, feeling the raw vibration of their engines. Truth is, the Hornet was the Navy's workhorse, basically a versatile fighter capable of battling enemy jet and contact dry land targets with equal ferocity. The shooter on the deck signaled, and the pilot saluted. Notably, in a blink, the catapult fired, flinging the 20-ton jet from 0 to 160 miles per hour in 2 seconds. Actually, the pilot was pressed back into his seat, the G-forces crushing the air from his lungs until the jet leaped off the edge of the deck and roared into the night sky. Really, forming up in the darkness, the Hornet streaked north towards the Iraqi coast. Their missionary post was to pave the way for the ground troop, destroying ordnance positions and armored combat vehicle columns that threatened the intrusion force. So, what does this mean? Through their night vision goggles, the universe was a wash of green. Below, they could see the faint light of towns and the darkness snake of the Euphrates River. Suddenly, the radar warning receivers in their cockpit lit up. Iraqi radiolocation had locked onto them. The pilots reacted instantly, their preparation taking over. In fact, they dispensed chaff and flares, bright decoys that burned hot to confuse heat-seeking missiles. Also, the Hornets turned over and dove, evading the invisible threat. Then, they retaliated. Clearly, laser-guided bombs detached from their wings, gliding silently towards the radar sites that were hunting them. As the foe eyes were blinded, instant later, bright flash illuminated the forsake story. To the west, in the vast, clear deserts near the Jordanian border, the Air Force SF-15E Strike Eaglet. These were big, powerful jets, painted a dark gunship gray, designed to fight their way into enemy territory and beat a massive payload. Importantly, their target was the Scud missile launchers. Without question, the coalition commanders feared that Hussein would launch chemical or biological weapons at Israel to widen the war, just as he had done in 1991. The Strike Eagle crews, a pilot and a weapons scheme officer sitting in tandem, scanned the barren landscape with their advanced radio detection and ranging. The desert was full of hiding places and culverts where a mobile missile launcher could vanish. The wireless crackled with a report from a special forces team on the Earth. The truth is, they had spot a dash catapult moving under the cover of shadow. The strike bird of Jove pilot banked the jet hard, pushed the throttles to afterburner. 2 tongues of blue flame shot from the rear, basically of the aircraft as it accelerated to supersonic speed. The weapons officer in the rear place manipulated the targeting pod, zooming in on the grainy infrared image of a heavy hand truck transport, a long, cylindrical object. It was a race against time. If the launcher set up and fired, it could mean disaster. The airplane pilot lined up the attack run, diving towards the desert floor. He released a GBU-12's laser-guided bomb calorimeter. The reality is, the optical maser spot from the targeting pod painted the truck, and the bomb calorimeter post-date the light like a moth to a flaming. The explosion was absolute, turning the threat into writhy alloy and burning rubber. The western flank was secure. Think about it this way. Really, as the air war intensified, the shock and awe cause began in earnest. Notably, the sky over Baghdad turned a violent shade of orange and red. Naturally, it was a display of firepower unlike anything history had ever seen. Cruise missiles set up from ships hundreds of miles away threaded the needle through the urban center streets, striking government ministries and presidential palaces. The B-2s returned, dropping bunkers that punched through foot of reinforced concrete before detonating. So, what does this mean? The ground shook, and the air was filled with the roar of detonation. The goal was not to destroy buildings, but to destroy the will of the foeman to battle. The Iraqi command and control structure was being severed, the head cut off from the body. General could not talk to their tank commanders. Politicians could not talk to the press. Surprisingly, the regime was deaf, dumb, and blind. While the heavy bombers and strike fighters pounded strategical targets, the F-16 Fighting Falcons were doing the gritty, dangerous work of close air support. These were the quick, single-engine fighters that the pilot wore like a second skin. They flew low, right above the heads of the pass Army and Marine column. As the Earth force crossed the border, breaching the sand berms and pouring into Iraq, they immediately met resistance. Let me put it this way. Of course, Iraqi tanks and artillery were dug in, waiting to ambush the invaders. A frantic call came over the radio from a forward air controller implant with a Marine unit. They were pinned down by heavy machine gun fire from a fortified building. Definitely an F-16 pilot, circling high above, heard the call. Troops in contact, the controller yelled. Usually, the pilot immediately rolled his aircraft onto its back and pulled the nose down, dive towards the field of honor. The thing is, he could see the tracer, arsed rear and forth between the two forces. In fact, he fortified his cannon and selected a MAV projectile. The F-16 screamed down, the air current rushing over the canopy. Surprisingly, the airplane locked the missile onto the building, the crosshairs sweetie despite the bedlam below. He called out, the code word for launching a rebel. The missile exhaust trailed a plume of white, kind of smoking as it slammed into the foe place. The machine gun firing stopped instantly. The Marines on the ground cheered, dusting themselves off and travel forward. Certainly, the F-16 pulled up, its afterburner glowing, climbing back into the safety of the altitude, ready for the next call. Here's the deal. The working together between the air and the land was the defining feature of the campaign. In previous wars, the air campaign would last for weeks before a single soldier stepped foot on foeman soil, obviously, but this time, it was simultaneous. The squirt were the flying artillery for the tank. The F-15Es, having finished their Scud hunting, shifted roles to interdiction, destroy bridges to prevent Iraqi reinforcements from moving south. The F-818s from the carriers provided a constant umbrella of protection, refueling in midair to stay on station for hours. The skies were crowded with American power. Obviously, the AWACS planes, with their significant rotating radar domes, act as the traffic controllers of the war, directing jets to where they were needed most, ensuring that every bomb dropped had a purpose. But the Iraqi air defense system was not entirely dead. What we're seeing is, as ASAMs would pop up and fire, in the confusion of the battlefield, mobile surface-to-air missile units known. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse. The wild weasels, F-16s specially equipped to hunt radar, were the bait. In fact, they would fly into the kill zones, waiting for an Iraqi radar operator to turn on his scheme. The moment the radar beam touched the F-16, the pilot would fire a HARM, a high-speed anti-radiation projectile. The projectile would ride the radar radio beam right back to its source, destroying the antenna and the crew. It was a terrifying job, requiring nerves of steel, for to kill the foeman, you number one had to let them see you. But here's what's interesting. Here's the deal. As the days turned into weeks, the sheer tempo of operations began to take a toll on the pilots. Really, they were flying long mission, often 6 or 7 hours in the cramped cockpits, fueled by adrenaline and go pills. They slept in shifts, debriefed, ate, and moved right back to the flight line. The ground crews worked miracles, fixing hydraulic leaks and loading quite heavy ordnance in the heat and rubble of the desert airfields. The B-2 pilot, flying 30-hour round trips from Missouri, were pushing the bound of human endurance. They would take turns sleeping in a lawn chair brought into the small cockpit while the other airplane pilot monitored the systems. But no one complained. They knew that every bomb they dropped, every tank they destroyed, entailed one less menace for the soldier on the ground. The initial push towards Baghdad was faster than anyone had predicted. The heavy armor of the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Section and the U.S. Marines raced across the abandoned floor. Interestingly, but they were approaching a critical choke point, the city of Nasiriyah. No doubt, it was a crucial bridge crossing over the Euphrates. Hornets, and the Iraqi decided to make a stand there. The metropolis get a hornet's nest of resistance. The Marines of Task Force Terror were caught in a brutal trap. Certainly, tracks were burning, and men were dying. Calling out for air support, urgent and desperate. The sky above Nasiriyah filled with the roar of jets. F-818 and 8B Harriers swooped down, trying to picking out enemy targets in the dense environment. It was a nightmare, scenario for an airplane pilot. Generally, the enemy was concealment in schools and hospitals, utilised civilian as shields. The rules of engagement were strict. The pilot had to be certain of their target. An F-818 airplane pilot circulate, watching the tracer zip from an alleyway. He couldn't drop a LOM calorimeter without risking the nearby houses. He had to be surgical. He dove low, using his cannon to strafe the alley, the rounds chewing up the pavement and silencing the ambushers. It was Finnish, dangerous work, flying within range of small blazon firing and shoulder-fired missiles. South of Baghdad, a massive sandstorm began to brew. It was a shamel, a wall of red debris thousands of foot high that swallowed the world. Clearly on the ground, the soldiers huddled in their vehicles, unable to, more or less, see sink feet in front of them. The Iraqis thought this was their chance. They believed the American Air Force couldn't fly in the storm. They moved their Republican Guard divisions out of their hiding spots, preparing to counterattack the stalled American columns. Here's why this matters. They were wrong. And here's the thing. The technology of the U.S. aircraft allowed them to see through the weather. The F-15Es and B-1 bomber, using synthetic aperture radar, could see the metal shapes of the Iraqi tank through the swirling dust. What followed was a slaughter. The Iraqi columns, thinking they were invisible in the tempest, were decimated. Bombs fell from the clouds with zero visibility, guided by GPS coordinates. The pilot couldn't see the ground, but their instruments told them everything they asked to know. The Republican Guard, the elite of Saddam's army, was being dismantled systematically. What's more, of T-72 tanks littered the desert, destroyed by an enemy they never saw. The storm that was supposed to save them became their tomb. The air power had effectively paralyzed, the foeman's ability to maneuver. As the storm cleared, to Baghdad lay open. The Karbala Gap, the narrow strip of land between the lake and the city, was the final hurdle. Usually, the F-A-818s and F-16s swarmed the country, destroying artillery pieces that were ranged in on the gap. As the jets thunder overhead, the air controllers on the ground, dusty and exhausted, looked up and gave a thumbs up. The synergy was complete. The land force locomote through the gap, the steel tread of their tanks grinding the road to dust, while the silver wings above kept watch. The regime was crumbling. The statues were about to fall. The final act of the drama was approaching. Plus, the pilot checked their fuel gauges, fortify their weapons, and turn their noses toward the capital. The thing is, portion 2, the urban center of ghosts, the road to Baghdad was paved with the wreckage of a regime that had believed its own propaganda. As the duster cleared and the sun beat down on the Iraqi abandon, the silhouette of the working capital city began to rise from the haze. It was a sprawling metropolis of brown concrete, an ancient chronicle, essentially, a urban center of 5 million people property its breath. Sometimes, the American armored columns, the steel tip of the invasion, were poised at the gates. But the final lock had to be picked from the sky. The air war was about to shift from the open desert to the claustrophobic canyons of the city street. In fact, the pilots of the coalition Air Force tightened their oxygen masks. The easy targets were proceed. The foeman was hiding among the citizenry, in the schools, the mosques, and the crowded markets. Usually, the margin for error had vanished. Without question, high above the metropolis, the B-2 turret bomber were still on the prowl. Their mission had evolved from destroying vast airfields to decapitating the leadership. Intelligence reports were flooding in. Whispers of where Hussein and his sons might be hiding. A bunker here, a safe house there. The B-2 pilots, exhausted from their marathlights from Missouri, had to remain razor-sharp. They were dropping the bunker busters, massive bomb designed to penetrate deep into the globe before exploding. Definitely, one specific foreign mission targeted a restaurant in the Mansour district where Saddam was rumored to be meeting his generals. The reality is, importantly, the B-2 glided silently through the dark, a black triangle against the stars. The coordinates were keyed in, the doors opened, and 2,000-pound bombs plummeted toward the city. The impact was felt miles away, a dull thud that shook the foundations of the city. While Hussein escaped that night, the message was clear. There was no sanctuary, no hole deep enough to hide from the range of the American air powerfulness. Closer to the ground, the F-15E Strike Eagles were acting as the eyes and ears of the advancing army. Frankly, the Strike Eagle was perfect for this phase of the war. Clearly, its effective radiolocation and advanced targeting pods allowed the weapons scheme military officer in the rear seat to zoom in on individual windows of a building. As the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division prepared for the first roar run, daring armored dash straight into the ticker of Baghdad, the F-15s were already budget items scanning the route. They look for heat signatures of ambushes, for, basically, the telltale shape of tank concealing in alleyways. And here's the thing, the pilot flew the jet in a lazy orbit, conserving fuel, while the Wizzo in the back worked the sensors. Contact contact, the Wizzo said, his voice calm over the intercom. Now, here's where it gets good. He had spotted a group of Iraqi Republican Guard soldiers setting up a rocket-propelled grenade team on a rooftop overlooking the highway. The coordination was instantaneous. The F-15E gang passed the coordinates to the armored combat vehicle commanders on the Earth, but the tanks were still miles away. Clear to engage, arrived the order. The pilot turned over the heavy jet in, selecting a precision-guided bomb. In the urban environment, they utilized smaller fuses to limit the blast radius. The bomb calorimeter detached, guiding itself to the laser place painted by the Wizzo. It didn't level the building. It didn't need to. It struck the rooftop with surgical precision, neutralizing the menace instantly. The main road was open. Interestingly, the tanks began to roster, their turbine engine whining, kicking up junk as they charged toward the metropolis limits. This was the new face of war, a seamless integration where a pilot at 15,000 foot was protecting a soldier on the ground who he would never meet. As the tanks entered the suburbs, fundamentally, the fighting became chaotic. The Iraqis threw everything they had at the invader: suicide vehicles, technical trucks with mounted machine gun, and desperate infantry charges. The sky above Baghdad became a stacked deck of aircraft. Also, F-16 Fight Falcons and FF-18 Hornet buzzed like angry wasps, stacking up at different altitudes, waiting for their turn to strike. Look, an Air Force color on the ground, embedded with a armored combat vehicle platoon, was shouting into his radio. They were take heavy fire from a authorities ministry building. He needed help fast. What we're seeing is an F-16 pilot, call sign Viper 1, took the check-in. He was low on fuel, but he had 2 bomb left. Viper 1, soldiery in contact, risk close. The accountant shout. Danger closes meant the enemy was within 600 meters of friendly troops. Drop a bomb calorimeter was risky. The shrapnel could hit the American. Let me put it this way. The pilot had to be perfect. He dove the F-16 down. The city hastens up to see him. Think about it this way. He could see the flashes of armored combat vehicle cannons and the return fire from the building. It was a chaotic mess of smoke and tracers. He lined up his pellet, trusting his computer, trust his training. He let go the bomb and pull up hard. D-forces pin the arse. The bomb calorimeter slammed into the side of the ministry building, blowing out the wall where the foeman firing was advent from. The American tanks pushed forward through the smoke. Sometimes, good hits, the controller confirmed. The airplane pilot let out a breath. He didn't realize he was property and turned the tanker to refuel. The battle for Baghdad International Drome was an important turn point. It was the prize that would allow the alignment to fly in supplies and reinforcement. Besides, the Iraqi defense there were stiff. The reality is, they knew if they lost to the airport, the war was effectively over. Here's the bottom line. Under the cover of shadow, the U.S. Army launched its assault. Overhead, the F-18 Hornet from the aircraft carriers in the Gulf were providing close air support. Really, the night was lit up by flare and explosions. The Hornets used their infrared cameras to pick out Iraqi armored vehicles attempting to counterattack the airfield. It was a shooting gallery. The Iraqi tank, blind in the dark, were destroyed one by missiles that came from nowhere. By morning, the drone was in American hands, a graveyard of twisted metal. Plus, the first C-130 transport planes were landing on the track before the fires had even gone out. Here's why this matters, but the regiment hadn't yet surrendered. Importantly, in the center of Baghdad, the info minister, quickly dubbed Comic Allah by the Western pressure, was holding pressure conferences, claiming that the Americans were committing suicide at the gates of the city and that Iraq was winning. As he spoke, American M1 Abrams tanks were rolling into vista crosswise the river behind him. The disconnect was surreal. Without question, the final Thunder Run on April 7th pierced the heart of the city. Interestingly, the armor columns smashed through the defenses and seized the presidential palaces. Besides, the F-15s and F-16s fly show of force emissions, screaming low over the urban center at supersonic speeds. The sonic booms shattered windows and the morale of the remaining defenders. It was a psychological hammer blow. The roar of the jets was the sound of inevitable defeat. Frankly, the pilot looking down saw a city in transition. Clearly, one moment, they were bombing a Republican Guard position. The next, they saw civilians coming out into the streets, tentatively at number 1, then in droves. They saw looting, they saw chaos, but they also saw the collapse of fear. The complex air defense network that had worried the planners for months had been dismantled piece by piece. The radar screens in the jets, once cluttered with threats, were now largely clear. The sky belonged to the coalition. Definitely, the F-18 pilot flight off the USS Abraham Lincoln begin to see the end. They had flown thousands of sorties, dropped millions of pounds of ordnance, and now they were watching the ground troops secure the final objectives. The climax came on April 9th in Firdousi Square. A grouping of Marine had secured the area, home to a monumental statue, Hussein. A bunch of Iraqis gathered, their anger at decades of oppression bubbling over. They took sledgehammers to the plinth, but the statue was too strong. An American recovery vehicle, a modified tank designed to tow broken armor, backed up. A chain was wrapped about the statue's neck. High above, an F-16 pilot circled, watching the scene unfold on his direct pod show. Think about it this way. He wasn't dropping bomb today. He was as a witness to history. He watched as the vehicle force, the metal groaning, until the statue tipped and fell forward, leaving only the wrestle alloy feet on the pedestal. What we're seeing is, the crowd swarmed the fallen idol, beating it with their shoes. The airplane pilot keyed his mic. Statue is down. On top of that, I repeat, the statue is down. Besides, the autumn of the statue was the symbolic end of the regimen. As well, the work for the jet wasn't over. Baghdad had fallen in weeks, a feat of military speed that stunned the world. What's more, the city was now lawless. The aircraft shifted roles again. Sometimes, instead of work-stopped missions, they fly armed overwatch. They become the guardians of the city, watching for looters, pretty much for insurgents, for anyone attempt to destabilize the fragile new reality. But here's what's interesting. The F-15Es used their pods to scan for roadblocks and gathering crowds, relaying the information to the troops on the ground who were trying to restore order of magnitude. The BD-2s returned to Whiteman Air Force Base, their stealth mission extensive. Usually, the crews climbed out of their cockpits, stiff and exhausted, into the arms of their families. They had fly high halfway around the creation to deliver a knockout punch, and they had succeeded. The swift victory was evidence of the power of air supremacy. Really, the Iraqi ground forces, one of the largest in the region, had been unable to maneuver, unable to communicate, and unable to hide. Generally, the unity between the B-2's strategic scope, the F-15E's deep work stoppage capability, the A-818's versatility, and the F-16's agile close air support had created a force multiplier that the Iraqi regime could not withstand. The shock and awe wasn't just about the number of bombs, it was about the speed of the collapse. The enemy was paralyzed before they could even formulate a defense. Honestly, as the sun set over Baghdad in late April, the metropolis was dark, the power grid damaged by the war and years of neglect. But in the sky, the lights of the coalition jet were still visible, twinkling ilk-moving adept. Besides, the pilots fly their lonely patrols, look down at the Tigris River winding through the darkened city like a black ribbon. They cognized that the combat phase was ending, but a new, uncertain chapter was beginning. They had done their job. They had removed the regime. They had cleared the way. Really, the B-2s, the Eagles, the Hornet, and the Falcons had proven that in modern warfare, whoever controls the sky, control the destiny of the ground beneath. The roar of the engine began to fade from a fight scream to a patrol hum. Honestly, the carrier in the Gulf started to bend for place. Their magazines empty, their flight decks worn. The Air Force bases in the part began to rotate crews. The intense adrenaline of the invasion was replaced by the steady rhythm of occupation and stabilization. But for the history books, the story was already written. In a matter of weeks, a dictatorship that had stood for decades was swept away by a storm of steel and technology. Naturally, the pilots who flew those missions would never forget the view from the cockpit, the tracers arching through the dark, the wall of dust swallowing the creation, and finally, the sight of a statue falling in a square, signaling the end of an era and the beginning of another. Here's the bottom line. The sky was clear. And here's the thing. The mission, in its military sense, was accomplished. Baghdad had fallen.